80% lack access to adequate sanitation. 35% lack access to clean water. Very much for these reasons, diarrheal diseases kill more than 2 million children under 5 each year. Indoor pollution kills 11 times more people in low HDI countries than others, and 20 times more than in very high HDI countries. Second message of this report is that unequal power relations lead to unequal environmental impacts. Who makes the decisions on what we do about the environment? We need to look both within countries, who are the major influences on national policy, and we need to look internationally at the intergovernmental level. What are the countries that are the loudest voices on where we go as a world community? Well, within countries, certainly in the West, we know that petroleum lobbies are a very influential voice on how wealthy countries handle environment. Last year in the United States alone, petroleum lobbies spent $1.5 billion on influencing American policy on the environment. Business, very powerful lobby on what countries do nationally on the environment. It's not the poor. That's the point I'd like to make. The ones that will be most affected by irresponsible environmental policy are precisely the ones that have no voice today. It's also men. Men in most countries call the shots. We'll talk about that. But it's the power imbalance between men and women which needs to be fixed. And there's been empirical research in this year's report to show that with more voice given to women at the community level, the village level, at the family level, we'll have a tremendous progress in controlling the environmental forces that are leading to disaster. Again, democracy and environmental quality, this year's report makes very clear, are linked. The more that we can give voice to the poor, the more that we can be sure that environmental policies at the national level will be stronger and more robust. These are the people that will be most impacted by environmental disaster in the future. And again, they're the ones typically that have the least voice on policy. I don't know if many of you have heard about the Alliance of Small Island States, but if you haven't, there are many others who've never heard of this alliance. And when we look at the intergovernmental level, United Nations, the global forums for influencing environmental policy, these countries, these small island states in particular, will suffer the most with any environmental catastrophe in the future. They already are. Rising sea levels are making life very difficult for many communities today and many countries. But there as well, it's not the small island nations that have a big voice at global forums. Gender. Again, one of the most significant power imbalances today is between men and women. I always say to my friends, if women ruled the world, it would be a better place. And this year's research makes very clear that there is something to that notion when it comes to the environment. You see, there are three major drivers for the environmental trends that we're so most concerned about. One is population growth. Second is consumption. And the third is the type of production that we are using for development. Population growth. One of the key statistics in this year's report is that in countries where women have free access to family planning and contraceptive use, growth rates are lower. In most of those countries, it's just at replacement rate. That's a good thing. Halving by 50% last year's population growth rate, the 2010 population growth rate, could provide up to 30% of the carbon dioxide emissions reductions by 2050, and up to 41% by the end of the century to avoid dangerous climate change. Family planning is not just something that we worry about children. It can have a tremendous impact on the future of our environment. Of course, you'll all recognize the woman in the top right-hand corner, Kenyan, Wangari Maathai, who passed away very recently. Is one of the true leaders in human rights, democracy, and the environment. An inspiration to us all, and a good example of the key leadership role that women can play, not only at the NGO level, but at the parliamentary level. Again, where women have higher presence in parliaments and policy making, environmental policy is clearly and empirically stronger. Last and final message from this year's report: innovative responses and major investments are needed. You look at the first bar in terms of what is estimated to be the required expenditure for climate change, and then low carbon energy and water and sanitation. And there's a range of estimates, it's not all very clear, but you can tell that even at the lowest estimate of need, we're not even close. We as a world community have clearly not walked the talk in terms of climate financing, despite the proliferation of climate funds, despite big conferences that are coming up. Not enough money. New financing sources are needed, and this year's report revisits a proposal from the 1994 Human Development Report for a tax on international currency transactions. Now, it was kind of seen as quite radical back in '94, but those same currency markets have evolved very efficiently over the past 16 years. And it's seen as one of the easiest and the most lucrative way to generate financing for climate change and environment. A 0.005% tax on international currency transactions would generate an estimated $40 billion annually that could be put to use to prevent major environmental disasters. Again, I mentioned earlier the need to revisit fiscal priorities, and the easy target of that is defense expenditures. Globally, 3% of world GDP is currently spent on military. A small fraction of that would be enough to cover the environmental needs of the world. And I just want to conclude with re-emphasizing this win-win-win policy solutions. Policies that focus on environmental sustainability, equity, and human development. And those policies are very clearly further investments in access to renewable energy, water and sanitation, and reproductive health. Those are very much the ground level policies that will create a win-win-win situation. And that's why I'm glad UNICEF colleagues are here, and UNFPA as well. Very important that their causes be advanced for the good of the future of the world. The main messages for my presentation today were the following. The main one was equity and sustainability are linked, and they do create certain policy dilemmas for governments, but it's not an insuperable problem. Environmental threats hurt the poorest the most. The ones that will be most affected are the least responsible for creating the problem that we're in. There's an element of justice here also. This report does go into quite a lot of discussion on social justice, distributive justice, and what we would all agree is simply a wrong pattern where those that will be affected worst are the least responsible for these problems. Unusual power relations create unequal environmental impacts. Both within countries, the poor have the least voice in setting policy, and at the intergovernmental level, countries that will be affected the most also have the least influence on global dialogue. And finally, innovative responses and major investments are needed. Sorry. I always conclude with this picture because I think this captures, again, the central message behind this year's report and behind development generally. We always ask ourselves, and UNDP is asked a lot, what is development? What do you guys do? What does the UN system do on development, given that so many agencies are involved with it? I believe the common denominator in all that we do in development is expanding the range of choices that people have in their lives. And this year's report is all about that. It's about choices today, and it's about choices tomorrow. Thank you.